Radio Algeria International presents International Policy Code, a weekly program hosted by Lasfer Mazari.
At their peak, coalition forces numbered some 140,000 troops, the majority American. Now about 10,000 U.S. soldiers remain, half of whom will leave next year from a war President Obama promised to end. He has pledged to pull the last U.S. soldiers from Afghanistan in December 2016. But 2014 was the war's bloodiest year, with over 5,000 Afghans from the army and police died in insurgent violence. Our guest in our program is Stephen Farnsworth, professor of political science and international affairs at University of Mary in Washington. Professor Farnsworth, welcome to our program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
The U.S. combat mission officially ended on December 31st, 2014, but both President Ashraf Ghani and the U.S. military will have to convince Obama, who says America's longest war must come to an end. How about the current transition plan for transferring responsibility to Afghans, Professor Farnsworth?
Well, I think it's very important that this transition plan proceed as rapidly as possible. The best situation for Afghanistan is to have as much control as possible over its own future, and the best situation for the United States is to have Afghanistan have as much control over its own future as possible. Mm-hmm. The process is long and it's painful for all concerned, but it's important to remember that Obama faced a situation that was handed to him by a previous president, and that he has handled it, it strikes me, responsibly.
Well, Pakistan and India have asked U.S. officials to reconsider their decision to withdraw troops by 2016 after seeing the rise of the Islamic State militancy across Iraq. The call to reconsider the withdrawal date has been echoed by several U.S. lawmakers as well.
Well, I think that it's clear that the situation with respect to Syria and Iraq, the loss of territory to Islamic State so-called group, is going to require some rethinking. And one of the things that will become clearer as the months progress is whether or not that timetable still does make sense. I don't think that Obama, who is by nature a pretty careful, thoughtful politician and president, is likely to stick with the original plan if further evidence suggests that that's a bad idea. And so I think that what we're looking at right now is sort of a test phase for the new Afghanistan government, what they're capable of doing, and whether or not that timetable as originally put forward will continue to make sense as we look at the months ahead. I think that a lot can change in a few months. If you look at the rebel situation in Iraq in particular, that expanded very rapidly, hardly being heard of, to controlling significant territory in the country. And at one point, there was a great deal of fear that their forward momentum would continue. But if you look at the situation in the last few months, it does seem that the original estimates for what they were able to do, the movement seems to have largely stalled. So it's important to recognize that certain situations, certain plans have to be adjusted to new events. And it seems to me that Obama is exactly the sort of person who would not be caught up on keeping to the original plan if new evidence suggests a different course.
We see what happened in Iraq, and after the U.S. withdrawal, could the same thing happen in Afghanistan?
I think that that's always a possibility, but we in the United States have had the impression that the United States military and the coalition forces had produced a very professional, well-equipped, well-trained military in Iraq, and the performance of the Iraqi military left a lot to be desired. I think that, but part of the problem, it's important to recognize when you think about Iraq, had to do with the less than professional performance of the Maliki government. By engaging in a really sectarian approach to eliminate some of the minority voices in Iraq from government, it created an environment where people were much more willing to listen to extremists. I think that one of the bright spots with the new Afghanistan government is the willingness to develop a coalition that tries to keep more people inside the government than forcing them outside. And there's very little positive news that one can say about these kinds of difficult transitions, but I do think that the decision to broker a power sharing agreement is one of the bright spots that we can look to, and one of the reasons why Afghanistan may not be as problematic as Iraq going forward.
Could Afghan security forces prevent the country falling into the hands of terrorists?
I think it's important to recognize that a great deal of what happens will have to do with resolve and resources.
Well, the U.S. came to Afghanistan after 9/11 to defeat al-Qaeda. 13 years later, as the U.S. leaves, al-Qaeda is still there. Was it difficult to identify the enemy?
Well, I think it's important to appreciate that there were significant mistakes made, in my view at least. I don't represent the government, but it's important to, my personal view is that significant mistakes were made with respect to Afghanistan. I think that fundamentally the Bush administration took its eye off the ball when it decided to divide its energies and resources between Afghanistan and Iraq. The claims that were used to justify in the United States the war in Iraq did not turn out to be supported by evidence, and we know now that the Bush administration did not evaluate that evidence in anything approaching an objective fashion. There was a conclusion that they had derived, and the evidence that was supportive of that was what was emphasized. And so for many, many years, I think the Afghanistan situation festered on the back burner because so much of the U.S. attention focused on Iraq, which, of course, was not connected to 9/11. I think that that part of the problem in Afghanistan is the fact that there were so many years where the attention of the coalition was focused elsewhere. I think that was a very serious problem and a serious mistake, and one, by the way, that Obama, when he became president, did much to rectify. But I think it's important to recognize that movements exist for reasons, and they are not going to disappear. They may be stronger or weaker depending on the circumstances, but it seems to me the longer and the more aggressive the international presence is in Afghanistan, the more problematic it's going to be for the Afghanistan government to be able to defeat the more extremist movements in the country, to keep them on the run.
Professor Farnsworth, some analysts say that the source of the problem was coming from across the border. What is your comment?
It seems pretty clear that there's a significant cross-border dynamic to this issue. What happened in the movement across the Pakistan border with Taliban, it's pretty clear that that there was some element of safe refuge that exists either explicitly or implicitly on the part of some of the governing forces in some of the more distant from the central government sections of Pakistan. Some of the term that we often use in the U.S. is the tribal areas. But the problem is one that is increasingly apparent within Pakistan itself. When you look at the instability and the problems that have existed, the violence that's now being visited on Pakistani officials themselves, I think it's pretty clear that the Pakistani government is appreciating the wisdom of distancing itself from terrorism, from the Taliban. They themselves are now becoming victim of these attacks, and that'll make it increasingly clear that a more unified front in the region is in everyone's best interests.
Professor, was the war worth it?
The polls in the United States show that most Americans do not feel that there was a return on an investment, to put it crassly. When you think about all the lives that were lost on all sides, when you think about the cost to the American taxpayer of the war, it is difficult to argue that the resources that were expended justify the return that developed. There's an old saying that hindsight is 20/20. It's very clear to see what you should have done after things have played out. My personal view is that the Afghanistan situation might have worked a lot better if the Iraq situation had not been added to the Bush administration agenda. But I think it's also true that the situation in Afghanistan was always going to be problematic. And as a result, you have to say that that there were so many what ifs that it's not necessarily clear what the best course was. I think that I might be thinking about it personally, be tempted to say that the U.S. maybe could have invested more and gotten out sooner with Afghanistan if they hadn't been bogged down and distracted by Iraq. Again, we can't imagine all the details of any hypothetical scenario. We know what we have here, we know what existed, and it's pretty clear that the way that this has played out has not been all that appealing. But it is also important to recognize the level of violence and terrorism that was existing before 9/11 in Afghanistan. People can, look at the situation right now as pretty unappealing. It is desperately unappealing if you look at the situation before 9/11 with the public beheadings and the mistreatment of minorities and women. The situation was really crying out for some sort of human rights intervention before 9/11. Irrespective of the attacks on the United States, the situation in that country and the human rights violation that were being engaged in those days were really beyond the pale.
Well, Professor Farnsworth, last question. What is at stake for Afghan President Ashraf Ghani for this year?
I think the big question is, can he put together with a power-sharing agreement a country that is more stable and more capable of being independent of international assistance? Can they handle the security threats that are severe on their own, or with less assistance than was the case during the Karzai years? And so, I think one might have reason to be optimistic. The power-sharing agreement is a huge step in the right direction, but time will tell exactly how well things work out.
Well, Stephen Farnsworth, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at University of Mary in Washington, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Have a good day.